Well, after some brilliant stalling, and
So, Kyle Pendred.
yeah, Carl Pender, go on with. Oh, another joke from you? Was it?
No. Seriously though, Kyle Pendred, I mean, he's a marginal UFC talent, but he's got stuff going for him. He's fun to watch, generally speaking, and he's Irish. That plays at this point in time. And Euro cards need help, and they need people that can be recognized. And Kyle Pendred's one of those guys. But there's definitely a much, much lower ceiling than a lot of his fellow countrymen and teammates. And as far as the 170, 185-pound weight range goes, I just can't think of a slower guy that I've ever seen. I think he's supplanted Ed Herman.
I'm not too sure about that. Now, I know he looked pretty gassy. I've seen
I'm not
like
even talking about him being gassed. I'm talking about like he looks like when he fights like he's underwater.
I don't think I've heard that before.
Like completely independent of how tired he might get. I don't think he has great cardio either, but independent of that, he is just slower than a guy that you'd expect in that weight class. He's just not that level of athlete. He's obviously physically strong and can hit hard, but those things aren't necessarily connected. This guy is not exactly one with the fast twitch muscle fiber, that's for damn sure.
Do you think, like, I know we're talking about it from our point of view, but do you think that guys like that can improve that? Is there anything that they can do? Are you just cursed with slow strikes, or you do wear
Well, I mean,
speed bands?
technique always helps. You know what I mean? You drill a jab a million times, you're going to get cleaner, straighter, probably flick it better. But if you just don't have that, like you're not going to make like massive gains. But I'm sure there is, stuff we said for. You just have to find a game that suits your ability. You know what I mean? Maybe it means you dirty box more, cut, less distance. Like your strikes are traveling less distance. You're maybe expending less energy if you're really good at it. Maybe the style that Kyle Pendred actually needs is to fight like Matt Brown. Who knows? There's definitely like tweaks you can make that can either enhance what you have or mask some of what's maybe a bit deficient about you. But more important than anything, Kyle Pendred just puts on entertaining fights and tries to beat the shit out of people or gets the shit beat out of him. I think that's cool and novel, and there's a place for that in the UFC. If they can go on you every time to go out, regardless of your opponent, regardless of whether or not you're impressive every time, because last time out, Kyle Pendred wasn't, but regardless if it's calculable that you're just going to go out and lob strikes for every minute of the 15 or more, cool, so be it. It's not exactly what we're talking about like a Leonard Garcia kind of dude around here. This is a dude that tries really hard, just tries to out-brawl and out-scrap people, still has a decent roundedness to his MMA game. It's just not a top-flight prospect. That's fine by me. He can hang out in the UFC so long as he doesn't do the 3 or 4 loss in a row thing.
Talking about that fighting style and the final Irish guy currently signed to the UFC, it's like you almost teed it up perfectly for me to go on to Neil Seery, the guy you once described as the dad who waits in the car park to beat up the younger stepdad. I think Neil is probably the most underappreciated Irish talent that we have at the minute.
Yeah.
Connor gets all of the headlines, and rightfully so. Cahill and Paddy get a little bit of it as well due to being associated with Connor. But what people don't really know, and I think I want to promote as much as possible, is that Neil Seery runs to work in the morning to get his cardio. He runs to training afterwards, and he still manages to train twice a day while working a full-time job and having a kid and wife.
Yeah, dude, he's a classic weekend warrior type, and these guys still exist in the UFC, But what's good for Neil Seery is he has personality. He's a guy who's funny and interesting and compelling too. Kenny Robertson in the UFC welterweight division. Kenny Robertson is a high school woodshop teacher and wrestling coach. He's got a wife and kid, and he also kind of looks just like a fattish, baldish, just stocky dad who might be able to beat someone up in, Home Depot parking lot or something like that. But no one cares about Kenny Robertson, even though he's had cool submissions in the UFC, because Kenny Robertson has, like, negative charisma. However, the other hand, man, with the Irish dudes, like, bare minimum always offer a little something in the personality department, but Neil Seery is a real charmer and an exciting guy to watch fight. Dealt with Phil Harris nicely, and I think he's on the November 8th card. I think he probably beats Richie Vaz, too.
A lot of people say he's one of the. A lot of people that I know that have interviewed him, he curses a ridiculous amount
Yeah.
in an interview, and I think that's people are. I don't know what the U.S. and Canadian people react to stuff like that. In Ireland, it's actually pretty common to hear people say "fucking" or "fuck" just as a like say, oh, did you see that fucking goal that was scored last night? That's pretty commonplace in Ireland. But if you said that, and I think that's one of the big appeals of Neil Series, that he's the working man's man in Ireland, and he just will absolutely leave it all out there, regardless of whether he wins or loses. I know he's at the stage in his career. Maybe 125 is a relatively weak division. They're running out of contenders for Demetrius. If the cards fell into place and Neil put 2 or 3 good wins and a couple of finishes together.
Yeah, I'm all about having him in the flyweight division. More importantly, like I don't see him as like a top flight title challenger, but just as a guy that can provide entertaining fights and be a cool story, and maybe have funny post fight interviews with Dan Hardy or Joe Rogan or John Anik from time to time. I'm all in. I think he's going to beat Richie Baz, and it'll make him 2-1. I think it's feasible that he finds someone else that his style plays to, he can beat. I don't think he's a guy on the fringes, and I think because of the European-Irish connection, him being a bit of a talker, that helps buoy him too. But most importantly, I think he's probably going to win his second UFC fight in a row and probably have an entertaining fight doing it.
One guy that we kind of look over a little bit because he's on the shelf at the minute, Norman Park, was supposed to fight Diego Sanchez in Mexico. In my opinion, that would have been not a career-defining fight for Norman Park, but he
would have beaten Diego.
Yeah, he would have beaten Diego. It's a name for him. He's put a great run together in the UFC. I think he's done the right thing in terms of his contract. He's just shut up. He hasn't called out anyone. He beat who the UFC puts in front of him. Now he can potentially be a 5-0, 6-0 fighter when renegotiation time comes around, instead of having called out someone early in his career and taking a bad loss.
You got to stay on that Neil Magny shit as our boy attempts to go 5-0 on the year this year and set that UFC benchmark. If you're a guy that is not a big name, if you're pretty anonymous, and maybe you don't have the skills or a style that like really lends itself to getting the crowd revved up or getting people on social media going crazy, you just got to keep your head down, keep your nose to the grindstone, and hope to kick some ass. And Norman Park's done that. I mean, he hasn't got the toughest matchmaking in the world, but he's gone out and handled. Like, I don't think he's the most entertaining guy to watch all the time. I felt pretty blessed when they lined him up with Kotani, just knowing how terrible Kotani's chin was and the fact that we wouldn't have to have 15 minutes of volume striking. But Park's a good technician, and winning is what ultimately counts. If he's able to just every step of the way just keep knocking him down. I mean, who looked at Rafael Dos Anjos coming into the UFC and then getting lamped by Jeremy Stevens and thought like, oh yeah, that dude's going to be knocking in for a title shot, and when lightweights rip roaring, looking like one of the best divisions that the UFC has to offer, like that guy's clearly going to be a stud. No, guys who actually just keep going about their business, improving their game as best they can, and making those incremental strides. Not everyone has like that linear progression, but it is good to see a guy like Park who stays very active and is noticeably better each time out, and has a realistic sort of idea that like, it would not suit Norman Park to come out calling boys out, whereas it might suit Conor McGregor. Different strokes, different folks, and I think the grindstone type angle works well for him. Hopefully he comes off the schneid soon, because he's not a dude that you want to see injured. I mean, it's nice to see guys, get their day in court, get to add the scalps that they need to their resume to advance. Guys like Diego need to be losing to good young fighters because their days are limited, and guys like Norman Park are more than ready to beat the shit out of guys like Diego Sanchez.
If I'm the UFC, I try to get him on the London card in February, although I know he has said before that he wants to kind of travel. And the same way what you said about Paddy Holohan, I've never fought in Canada before. I know Norman was looking forward to going down to Mexico, but the thing was announced yesterday as well that all the cast members from Tough 20 will be getting a fight on the finale. It includes Ashling Daly, one of the most respected competitors going into the house, probably the biggest veteran as well. And not you would probably be able to confirm on that if she had the most fights as a pro going into that. I think she may have.
Trying to think of people on the show that would have more fights. Does Felice Herrick have more fights? How many fights does Felice have? I don't know. I'd have to go through and check.
And a relevant point, she's fighting next week.
But in terms of length, you could have saved it more easily. In terms of like length and tenure, probably the longest tenured woman.
Okay, I have my pen here. Write that down. Length and tenure for next time. So she's fighting next week. From watching the show, I know, you may not know, whatever happens. Let's say Aisling Daly, she gets her fight in the finale. Let's say, for talk's sake, she's in the final or she's wherever she gets a fight. How do you see her doing in the UFC? Do you think there's a couple of good matchups for her that could get her maybe to 2-0, 3-0, and then we see what the state of the division is? Or could you match her up with someone straight away and that's a bad night for Ash?
Well, I mean, I think that's the problem with Aisling Daly is it really depends on style. You know what I mean? There's some people that she's just like she's not going to look good against. You know, like her Invicta fight against Barb Honchak, terrible kind of style matchup for her. A grinder like that who could shut her grappling game down, stick her up, or someone hyper physical. I mean, Sheila Gaff just did her dirty back in the day. And you kind of understand why when you see the way Aisling Daly fights and that kind of thing. So I think if she gets someone that she can have a technical kind of grappling match with, or someone that isn't a real serious athlete, she can definitely prosper. Her problems, I think, are going to come in when she faces people that are, you know, either way too physically much for her and can just take her down and bulldoze her, or can just some combination of, you know, what the Sheila Gaffs of the world did to her and some like combination of what like Barb Honchak or Katja Kankampapa did. They're physically stronger, they're better athletes. In the case of Sheila Gaff, a real tank. And Aisling Daly just didn't have the skills or requisite athleticism to sort of address that. But if she's facing women that are, you know, more pedestrian in that area and can actually engender that kind of grappling match, I mean, she's incredibly skilled on the ground, absolutely.
Yeah, I know you mentioned it earlier on, but you mentioned there Aisling had fought in Cage Warriors as well. Well, I know you're a fan of it. You think it's a great promotion. It's well polished. It's like in my opinion, Ian Dean is the best matchmaker in Europe. Cage Warriors cards are always stacked, and they're kind of going down this thing now. 2 main cards, a Super Saturday event. I know Cage Warriors next week, the 1st of November, has 2 main cards, and then in the Copper Box in London has 2 main cards. You could say that maybe that's because they didn't get the amount of shows that they were expecting in different Middle Eastern venues like Amman and Jordan, so they're just doubling up on main cards to make it seem like they're promoting something extra special. But what's your take on Cage Warriors this year?
Well, I mean, I think you're correct. That was my immediate response. And, like, when I first saw the release, I thought, like, what the hell's a double main card? How does this even make sense? And really, it only makes sense if you're suddenly doing less product, if you suddenly need to, you know, you owe fights to these fighters or whatever. So that was my thought as well. But Cage Warriors just soldiers on, man. I mean, the fact of the matter is it's harder and harder than ever. At the same time that they're doing more shows, traveling the world, doing, you know, broadening their horizons in Europe, but obviously doing way more stuff in the Middle East in general. At the same time, the UFC, Bellator, and so on have just really taken about as many fighters as you could feasibly take. So it's really like the feats, or the fire is always to the feet of Cage Warriors, especially Ian Dean, to keep drumming up new talent, finding good matchups. And the thing about Cage Warriors is it's like classic good matchmaking. You know what I mean? It's matchmaking that every sensibilities appeal to. You get stuff in Cage Warriors where it's like, dude, these guys are going to beat the fuck out of each other. And you get stuff where, you know, maybe it's prospect versus prospect in an embryonic stage, and it's articulated for style. Really, if you're getting drab, boring fights in Cage Warriors, it's just because it's a drab, boring fighter who happens to be probably a good fighter who either you know, just kept winning fights, kept his nose at the grindstone and prevailed, or is selling tickets. You know what I mean? Like Cage Warriors, everything makes sense, and that's nice. Plain and simple. Like there's not a lot of MMA promotions that do it right, especially in the face of adversity, especially while expanding in a lot of different directions. Cage Warriors, you know, even when, you know, it's a lamer card or a weaker card, generally still delivers. Bare minimum, you know, Cage Warriors puts on a lame card. Bare minimum, you can B-screen or open up your laptop, put it on the background. You might see someone get brained or see a cool submission. Nothing wrong with that.
What's the ceiling for them? Because the rumors around the European and Irish scene at the moment is that guys are coming towards the end of their contracts and they're not re-signing with Cage Warriors because they have removed something that was known as fighters as the Zuffa clause. So if you're 3-0 in Cage Warriors, you're the champion and you just tuned up the top contender in your lightweight division, and the UFC come calling, you were allowed to leave and you're allowed to go sign with them. Now all the new contracts are without the Zuffa clause. So if you're a guy who's kind of knocking on the UFC door, say for example you're Chris Fields, you went into tough, you realistically only need 2 good wins in Europe. Cage Warriors come along and offer you a 5-fight contract. It is the premier organization, but if I'm Chris Fields, I don't take that contract.
No, plain and simple. I mean, if your goal is to get to the UFC, never take a contract that could stop you from getting to the UFC. It's as simple as that. The only way it makes sense is if Cage Warriors are willing to offer more money to guys, and maybe I think that can be a self-limiting prophecy, because the guys who would be most apt to take that money are guys who are probably less ambitious, and ambition is generally something that you want in a high-level prize fighter. So I do think it's a relatively risky situation, but at the same time, it does depend on individual relationships. I get obviously any promotion wanting to stop the one-and-done appeal. What Cage Warriors needs to do to ensure that high-level fighters resign and the like is come to some kind of understanding that this is here, so ultimately you don't win a belt and take off. But at the same time, we're not trying to ruin your career and turn you into a Cage Warriors property forever. Because the minute promotions like Cage Warriors lose sight of what makes them valuable and the like, that's when you get into trouble. If Cage Warriors cops a stance of, no, we're going to try to retain Europe's best fighters, all the very best, that's asinine, that's not going to happen, and that's going to get you in trouble. Cage Warriors has always succeeded recognizing their value as a regional promotion. So I think I'm all for a promotion finding a way to crown a champion, actually keep that champion for a second, have them develop a bit. They just need to get to some kind of equitable, peaceable place with fighters where they understand that we're not going to try to harangue you and put you on the sidelines for 12, 18 months. We're not going to sue you or go crazy if you leave us after a year of being champion, that kind of thing. Because I think there's a big difference between ensuring that someone wins your belt and comes back and defends it a time or 2 or 3, and making sure people can't go to the UFC. There's a big difference.
When it comes to that, though, in my opinion, it looked really good for Cage Warriors over that period recently, where you had Conor McGregor, double champion, going off, getting signed by the UFC, Cathal Pendred going off and going to tough. Chris Fields was the world champion, then he went off. These guys are getting signed. In my opinion, the next guy from there is Nicholas Dalby, the welterweight. He's probably one more. If he wins in the copper box, I don't think he'll fight again with Cage Warriors. But do you think that they're a little bit worried that, as you say, it diminishes their brand? They have to know where they are in Europe, because undoubtedly, biggest promotion in Europe.
What is wrong with that? We're the best promotion in Europe. We've been doing this longer and better than almost any. What is wrong with that?
I suppose it depends with the financiers, maybe the guys from Dubai and the Middle East that are putting money behind it think, well, maybe they're close to ONE FC, they can see what those guys are doing over there. They're also in the middle of EFC Africa, who now have signed their first ever non-African fighter, signed an Irish guy, Peter Queally, to a 6-fight contract. I think, in my opinion...
The thing is, too, you mentioned ONE FC. ONE FC's got some pop and sizzle here and there, but ONE FC in many dimensions is an inferior promotion to Cage Warriors. You see it now. Speaking of, ONE FC had the opposite thing happen. They got some new deals done, and suddenly they were owing more dates. They had to do these new cards in Indonesia, Malaysia, so they added dates. The dates they added, the cards are shit. Unmitigated garbage. A weak Cage Warriors card is probably weak because you're these guys are kind of maybe they're UFC cast-offs coming back, lower ceiling guys, not prospects on the way up, or super local journeyman types, or maybe you identify a guy I don't really want to watch this dude fight, whatever. But it's not going to be top to bottom garbage. ONE FC, the best part of a lame ONE FC card is just hoping that all these undertrained guys commit heinous acts of violence against one another and no one ends up getting killed inside, the actual venue.
When it comes to ONE FC, they were kind of boasting for a while that they're going to be the only people in mainland China that they have all of these links. But then you have It seems to me that Cage Warriors are in the position that if they really wanted to solidify themselves as what they are, they can do it, but they're kind of in a growing stage that they don't know if they can go after being, like, convincing guys not to go to the UFC for another fight or two because of the exposure. Because EFC Africa, you have all of the health concerns. You had guys, like, medically, it's not very well run, and
Well,
they are...
EFC Africa, never mind the actual like medical situation. The refereeing is abhorrent. Like the violence you see, Super Fight League had some crazy shit because it's like undertrained. 1FC ends up being very dangerous because the combination of 1FC's rule set with ending up with a lot of guys who are like good strikers taking like but who are like neophytes. So you end up with a lot of fights where like one guy is particularly skilled in one area, maybe he's a hot shit striker but has only had like 2 or 3 MMA fights, and then he's able to knock a guy down and just wind up and soccer kick the hell out of him. So you get a lot of insane violence when you get undertrained fighters with big rule sets, but you also get hardcore violence when you just have terrible refereeing, which is unfortunately a huge part of the EFC Africa cards.
Do you think it has anything to do, something that I touched on massively in Sweden, was not happy with it at all? You know, you could have South African referees refereeing South Africans who think, maybe if I can let this guy take another shot or two, it's going to wake him up and he's going to de-scramble. You saw Akira Karsani take a ridiculous amount of damage from a Swedish referee in Sweden. The Swedish fighters were having an awful night. You saw it as well with Nicholas Backstrom, who got absolutely tuned up, knocked out, was out cold, and took more shots. Again, a Swedish referee.
Well, to be fair on the Nick Backstrom thing, he got stoned so quick that I have no idea. Like Wilkinson was just on him. You know, I mean, hell, there's even a shot at the end when I can't remember which referee stops it, but when Wilkinson's like pulled or pushed off of him, Wilkinson slides over his body and his knee smashes Nick Backstrom in the face again. Like he's already unconscious, and even like having the fight broken up, being in the process of being rescued, he gets smashed again inadvertently. You know, that's just bad luck, bad brutal luck.
Do you think that it's like we saw now the UFC with Kung Lee? Now is free to fight again, even though because they didn't use a WADA, I think it was a WADA approved drug testing lab in China, a technicality in my opinion that gets Kung Lee back into the ability to fight again. Then you see the UFC having to go under Sweden's Mixed Martial Arts Federation, Cage Warriors being stopped having fights. For the future of European events, do the UFC really need to up their regulation game, or is it just a case of, you know, we've had a bad couple of experiences this year, otherwise it's fine?
Well, I would say, I mean, up the regulation game. I think people's immediate assumption is like more testing, harder testing. The Kung Lee situation could have been avoided if they sent his samples to the WADA-approved lab, which was closer anyway. Like it was an irrational decision that led to a terrible outcome. Mistakes made. Problem solved. Well, I should say problem solved because we end up with another problem, and that's that Kung Lee gets off scot-free, even though I mean, people I looked at him pre-fight and went, "You're cheating." He went, "No, just good lighting." And then ultimately he cheated and then gets away with it. But where it's the kind of error the UFC should just reasonably, feasibly like never make again. Like why at this point now, any UFC event that is of an international nature where they're doing their own testing or whatever, that event, the samples should clearly go to the nearest WADA-approved lab. Just Google map it. Problem solved.
One more thing, Jordan, and we're going to let you go. The state of the EMEA events. You know, Gary Cook, Dana White was talking about how much of a stud that he was in Europe and he was getting stuff done. I actually thought Gary was a very good choice when he came in because he has deals. He had a deal with soccer and the British Premier League, and that's the biggest thing over here, massive money, the TV deals. He'd have all of the links. How do you think the EMEA market has evolved? Is there much more of a room for growth now? The rumours are next January, Alexander Gustafsson, Rashad Evans will be fighting in Sweden. Do you think that they've seen this year, they were down, I think it was 5,500 people in the arena because no Alexander Gustafsson in Sweden. Dublin card aside, I think the crowds were pretty much all down this year. Do you think that they now realize that they need those big name attractions because UFC as a brand just won't sell in Europe with substandard fighters?
Yeah, plain and simple. Like Irish people you might eat different things, say different things. You might say fuck more often, whatever. But people still know what they like to watch, and they want to watch fighters that they care about. I don't think it goes any deeper than that. Now, based on region, the fighters you care may vary. Obviously, more people care about Alexander Gustafsson than Gunnar Nelson in Sweden, which makes sense. But at the exact same time, you have to give people something decent. This is why like Conor McGregor are special. It's important and notable to have outstanding fighters from different countries that galvanize different markets. This is incredibly valuable. If you do have them, obviously, like if Conor McGregor wins the UFC featherweight title, are all of his title defenses going to be in Ireland? No, of course not. He's going to get pay-per-view points. It's going to make sense for him to be in Vegas and so on. But people from Ireland are going to care. One day, maybe he does one in England, maybe he does one back in Dublin. It'll be a huge deal. If someone from, I don't know, France eventually comes. Well, France is probably a terrible example because they don't give a shit about MMA. But if eventually we had a British fighter who finally prevailed, the sports media, they're going to care. There's suddenly going to be traction. There's going to be something. So I think it's a combination of factors. There's optimism because you see when you have someone like Conor McGregor, when it actually works that way, when you have someone that is talented, that has a personality that quickly galvanizes their national audience and audiences beyond their own country, sky's the limit. But at the same time, there was, I guess, this assumption forever that as long as it was local guys that it would sell, or just the UFC brand, if we build it, they will come. And that didn't work forever in America, didn't work forever in Canada. Why would it work forever in Europe? It already stopped working in the UK. It'll stop working other places. That's all there is to it. A good card isn't the same thing everywhere, obviously. A good pay-per-view card in Vegas is not the same thing as a good card in Ireland. It's just not. But you still have to be able to articulate what good is, and it normally goes far beyond things like lazy ideas like, just give them a lot of people from the country. They'll like that.
Well, Jordan, I have to say, the most articulate man I think I've ever spoke to, regardless of mixed martial arts or otherwise, or general conversation. Thank you very much for joining us today. I know that it's refreshing, I suppose, to hear, because in Ireland we've been talking about Conor McGregor for too long. We've seen him killing guys in Europe for a while. It's in the basketball halls, but now I think Irish people, I think it's fair to say, like, the soccer team isn't very good. The rugby team can pull it together now and again. But when an athlete comes along in Ireland, like you may or may not know with Olympic boxers, they really do get behind them. So I think when they hear guys from the US and Canada and stuff talking praise about an Irish athlete, it's something that you would never have heard of before.
No, I agree. Toronto doesn't have a huge Irish expat population, but I know a couple, and all of the dudes, none of them are like big sports dudes. All of them asked me about Conor McGregor as soon as they found out what I did. Hey, like, Conor McGregor, like, have you heard about him? Like, is he any good? Just genuinely intrigued and stoked when I'm like, yeah, he's actually incredible. He's bare minimum going to be a perennial top 10 guy, and at best could vie for a title and maybe even win it. People get stoked for obvious reasons. If you don't have a ton of international athletes to get fired up about, you're going to be pumped. If Poland finally ends up with a guy with a personality who happens to kick ass in MMA and wins a UFC title, they're going to be stoked. There's others. Who knows, dude? Latvia. Now, they played the World Hockey Championships a few years ago in my hometown in Halifax, and Latvia, they got hammered in more ways than one. They performed poorly in the tournament, but thousands of Latvian people showed up to Halifax and just got drunk and were super stoked about hockey. Like, what if there was a dope Latvian kickboxer who took over MMA? What if Kęstutis Arbosius is Lithuanian? I'm trying to think of a good Latvian. What's his name? Body shot guy. Konstantin Gluhov. What if Konstantin Gluhov became awesome and won the UFC heavyweight title. Maybe Latvia gets behind MMA in a way that you can never imagine. When you don't have a lot of dope athletes, when you just, I mean, America, it's like, you know, there's at least 20 basketball players you could buy a poster of if you walk 10 feet away from your house. You know, there's literally dozens of stars in the NFL. NFL rosters have 53 people on them. Almost all of them are American. The idea of just having another great American athlete is like, who gives a shit? But just like one athlete who kicks ass at something, especially something that's, you know, an internationally recognized sport or a compelling sport, that's not something like it's taken for granted in North America. But there's a lot of countries that don't have that kind of stuff. Like you see at the Olympics, every Olympiad, there's some country that wins its like first medal at the Winter Olympics or first medal at the Summer Olympics. And you just think, how have you never won one? But like some people just like that part isn't there, and there's a reason that countries galvanize behind these people. It's new, it's novel, it's strange, it's a source of pride, and it's fun, especially if it's fighting.
Well, Jordan, once again, we really appreciate the time. Any Irish people or European people that are watching this and are both enjoyed and loved by Jordan's voice, you know, we don't hear that too much around here. You head on over to Sherdog.com. Host of the Cheap Seats every Tuesday. We can't hear it every Wednesday anymore. I used to enjoy Tuesday and Thursdays. We don't have satellite radio over here, unfortunately. But also, I believe your laptop, etc., is all back up and running. So Press Row will be back every Wednesday or every second Wednesday and thereabouts.
Yeah, I mean, really, this week the slowdown was that our Crave office in LA, there was a power outage while TJ was away, and I guess the power outage fried the board. So he had to have a new board delivered. So
you mean he's only a couple of weeks into the job, and Aaron didn't know what to do when a massive power outage hit, and TJ was
What's worse is I want to say it was a scheduled power outage because I got like the update in my phone. It said like scheduled power outage 5 p.m. and I went like, what the fuck? What's a scheduled power outage? And I went, oh, it's because the Crave calendar syncs to my phone because they want people to act like they're all in the office in LA, even though we're telecommuting and whatnot. I wouldn't say it's Aaron's fault. I'd blame it on TJ, but full speed ahead for Dog Radio Network Roundtable, as well as Beatdown After the Bell of UFC 179.
Excellent, Jordan. Well, we're going to leave it at that. I think I'm going to be able to click this off live without cutting you off, so let's hope this works.